This means that both will be existent. However, the specific nuance that a team must prove is prioritizing one over another. Our side is not completely against the existence of international trade. However, we have the obligation to prove why food sufficiency must come first. Now on to my setup. Now, in the status quo, the biggest problem that impoverished people are facing is a lack of food. You can see this in continents like Africa, where children are heavily impoverished. And furthermore, there's also an obligation of the state, which ensures the basic needs of the people, something that we have to acknowledge. The way we do it is not only through economic interactions, but such as international trade, but instead more tangible things like providing food. On opposition, if we do international trade, there won't be a trickle-down effect. We must ensure that the most vulnerable actor, that means the people who cannot get food or afford food, can make it possible to get the resources. International trade mainly benefits the middle high class people instead of the lower class. Now, the government's purpose here, from a mechanization, is to focus on the sufficiency of its citizens instead of importing and exporting goods. We would like to put an emphasis on supporting the cycle of the economy internally, specifically on food sufficiency. In addition to that, there will be a high degree of compliance within society. The next level, consumerism, will continue to rise and demand increase. And so GDP is not an exclusive benefit to opposition, but also on our side because we keep demand up no matter what. Now, on opposition, your economic benefit is contingent on agricultural product through buying from international trade. This is not sustainable for just one structural reason. This means that if there is an insufficiency, there is a need to import. You cannot decrease export, nor can you just randomly adjust the amount of export. This is international trade overall. There will be backlash from the international community if there is this decrease. So there's no flexibility. Now on to my contention. The principle, why is it in state obligation to provide for the basic needs of the people? Well, first, prosperity and welfare of the people is not through economic benefit in the form of a direct fund, but also a high quality of food. Now, this is why, for example, in Indonesia, they provide, for example, free groceries. Second, the chronology for government advocacy is that internal issues should be settled first. The chronology that you should build your own policy as a government is to make sure that your internal affairs is settled first. This looks like before you can export a certain medicine, you must make sure that all citizens could get this said medicine. This is the same principle because this particular trade, because both products are going to be beneficial for the people, which is why we should prioritize food sufficiency. Now, we see that this is the principally correct direction of development within a country because we prove to you about how it is within the state's obligation that the internal situation needs to be better first before international trades are even held. Now, second, why is international trade not enough and why it doesn't work, only benefiting the highest class people? Now, in the end, even though you as a government can earn tax, the only people who benefit are the business people. Even if the food left over from international trade gets allocated somewhere, the most likely beneficiaries would be urban centers like cities instead of people who live in rural sections of the nation. Now, second, there's also a volatile international market. The trend in agriculture is extremely fast-paced. There are so many movements here and there. Now, this shows that even if agriculture is an integral part of an individual's life, but the degree of competition is super high that it makes them very risky to focus advocacy on that. Now, imagine here, you're an exporter of agriculture. This means that if externalities happen like the pandemic, inflation, and etc., you cannot simply bail out of production. This means that if extreme situations happen, governments will ignore their own population's need to prioritize international trade. Now, at that, assuming best case on upside that the money is being used for the most vulnerable, there is a harm of over-dependence from international powers. We don't know that the form of tax is used, or it will be used for roads and other infrastructures, because this is not what they need the most. Now, we show to you why international trade is very risky and give you 3 illustrations on how volatile an international market is, and which is why we should prioritize our side. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Proposition 1, I'd like to call property up 1.
Am I audible and visible?
Yes, to both.
Okay. My preferred pronouns are she and her, and I will only accept verbal POIs. I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, the major and rather embarrassing flaw with affirmative bench is that they assume that all countries, even the poorest ones, can easily recover from moments where the food supply that they try to keep stable runs out. So proud to oppose. So for our characterization, we see that this motion will also refer to like vulnerable, poor, and underdeveloped countries, the ones who need other countries to support them. So therefore, diplomatic relationships is crucial for them because they are vulnerable and prone to danger or natural disasters or whatnot. So they're too weak to be self-sufficient and rely on this world that proposition proposes to you. But for a burden, we see that government needs to prove to you, panel, why even in developing countries with infertile land and harsh conditions to grow food, they can help these countries. So before my arguments and rebuttals, the Prime Minister stated that international trade only focuses on the middle class and like therefore the government has it's like important for them to provide basic needs for everyone. But even if that is true, the inequality is worse on government side because if the food does run out or if it's lost by disaster, you can't get it back for like just about a year or two. So government is talking about, also proposition is talking about a very small amount of countries, more specifically authoritarian regimes that will not hand food that comes from trade to the poor people. So very small amount of countries that they're actually talking about here. And the second argument was basically the opposite of the first argument. So for our first argument about the instability of self-sufficiency with food, we say it's clear that because of climate change and changing global temperatures and whatnot, there are more natural disasters and there are floods, earthquakes, tornadoes, and all these other disasters that can wipe out land in a matter of minutes. So it's tragically simple. If a massive tsunami and consequent flood occurs in a coastal country like Japan or South Korea, that country's rice and crops are wiped out. The end, and that country's on their own because they prioritize self-sufficiency over international trade and agriculture. So even if proposition says that developed countries have enough money to easily recover from these circumstances, it's not the same with poor, vulnerable countries, right? And this connects to what I said in my burden. We say that the opposite and the better will happen under opposition's world, where countries prioritize trade. Even if some sort of disaster like a wildfire or flood occurs on your land and wipes out your agriculture, you have many international trade partners that are willing to help you out. For example, several states in the US suffer from disasters, such as California being prone to like millions of wildfires in a year. However, the other states that are less vulnerable to disasters are usually willing to help. And these don't even need to be states. Sometimes it's countries on the other side of the world, right? Anyways, this results in a more reliable source of resources that countries can count on. Even if the amount of crops that they have been growing is wiped out or lost for any reason, they have not one, but multiple trade partners that can assist and provide aid, specifically agricultural aid like wheat or plants, possibly animals. So for a comparative, basically, it's that the most vulnerable and poorest countries may lose their precious farming land because they were so reliant on this unsustainable resource, and they cannot even receive aid and help and trade from other countries, so they are left with no choice but to suffer. Meanwhile, under our world, even in the worst case where these countries don't have fertile land, at least they have generous trade partners. So the implications, firstly, self-sufficiency has harmed many individuals, and secondly, countries will likely lose more land if we follow Cross model. And for preemptive, government may say that they're like, actually, government already said that they're not completely cutting off trade, but that destroys their whole case. If you're giving into trading, then you're admitting that trading is important, right? Now, for a second argument about the cost of proposition side, obviously, international trade may be more expensive at first glance, but however, we tell you that there are actually other costs that affect the country in the long term. No, not short term. When you grow food self-sufficiently and don't prioritize trade. So, 2 points here. Firstly, water. If you use a lot of your water supply, much of it will go to waste since it's uncontrollable. For example, California uses so much water. In fact, like a lot of it, almost 90%, I think, on agriculture, and so much of it goes to waste, meaning that water prices increase and there are consistent droughts, and there's a chain of effects that are hard to actually control. But secondly, land, especially in developing countries, the land left over should be used for other sources of development, such as trying to build hospitals, like so that people don't die, infrastructure, and other necessary facilities. However, under government's world, a lot of money-driven farmers may continue to farm at the same land, meaning that the land soon becomes useless and fertile, and infertile, or the farmers find more land to farm, and that just wastes land. So for these reasons, I'm so proud to oppose. Thank you.
Yep, thank you very much. First up, I'd like to call proposition 2.
Adjudicator, just for clarification, am I visible and audible?
Yes, you are.
Thank you very much for that, adjudicator. Let me just quickly set a timer. Okay. All right. My time will start in 3, 2, one. Now, actually, side opposition clearly misinterprets the motion. They create scenarios in which it should be extreme situations and not the norm. They create a world in which, oh, disasters happen every other day, where that's not the case. The fact of the matter is that disasters are extreme cases, and I'll prove to you in my rebuttals and further on in my extension why overall their side should not fall under the basis and they should not win as a whole. Now, continuing to my rebuttals, their only point they brought up, they told you that developing countries are so infertile, hence they cannot go agriculture, and they supported this by saying that there are so many chances of disasters. They brought up the examples of tsunamis, tornadoes, and etc. Now, there are a few structural reasons to disprove this. First and foremost, on their best case scenario, they told you that these disasters happen, and the only alternative and solution is using international trade. Yet they neglect something so important, ladies and gentlemen, which is disaster or humanitarian aid. Yes, they will still get help from other international community. Why? Because just because they don't foster within international trade, it doesn't mean that they won't get help from international community. Countries like the US or organizations like the UN will obviously help out these developing nations if they are in dire need. If their country is plagued with, for example, a famine, they'll obviously help. There are organizations like USAID. There is the World Bank to even help them economically as a whole. Structural reason number two, their side is not exclusive. Now, even if disasters happen, disasters also happen on your side, and never prove why it will not impact international trade. Why? Because when it comes to international trade, there is a buyer and there's a consumer. This means that if the consumer gets impacted, then the buyer will also get impacted. This means that there is not a trade-off between the two actors. In the end, the international trade will also be diminished. Why? Because there's no one to buy from, or on the other side, there's no one to supply. On our side, by supporting the internal affairs first, we actually prove one, the moral obligation, and we prove two, that the international trade market is extremely volatile. This has been proven on my PM speech, and this has never been engaged with, ladies and gentlemen, because this is the reality. Now, moving on to my game-winning extension, we'll actually prove to you why our mechanism to get growth in agriculture is actually the most important. We bring up three main structural reasons. First and foremost, we'll improve the cycle of economic growth. How is this so? First, we invite more local people, local farmers, and local sellers to engage with your local market. Why? Because it's accessible. If these governments provide more food sufficiency towards the most vulnerable group, then they will also be incentivized to join the market. The fact of the matter is that in status quo, the market is so expensive. Whereas if we actually promote food sufficiency, this market will be much more cheaper and much more accessible for the most vulnerable groups. This is why their side is an extremely elitist side and does not take into account these citizens. Second, you have the power to control the price of your own produce. This is when stability within the prices happen, which can only happen without international trade, but instead with food sufficiency. Lastly, we create more innovation because exactly we can't import or export things. This pushes an urgency for development to happen. This means that there will be more local research that is going to happen. More innovation that is suitable and accessible will rise. This is also likely. Why? Because we don't need to spend any money on tariff, distribution costs, and other production costs. We can allocate the money for other things towards the development of technologies, development of other things to improve the agricultural as a whole. Third structural reason, we prove and develop other sectors better. Why? First, we fix the issue of food disparity. It's out of the political discussion. This means that governments have the time and have the resources to allocate their focuses to another important issue. For example, education, healthcare, and etc. Second, we say that in the societal level, if people can eat and have the leverage to gain produce so much easier, then it will be likely to allocate the political capital, asking for more rights that is more significant. Conclusion, this narrative not only impacts the people on the ground, but shows to you how important the policy is, which creates more innovation that is the prerequisite of efficiency of food. And we show to you that this policy affects the mindset of governments to make better demands in other aspects. With that, I've never been prouder to stand Gov. Thank you.
Yep, thank you very much. Proposition 2. Can we have the second speaker from Op?
Am I audible?
Yes, you are audible.
I will start in 3, 2, 1. This debate comes down to which side proves that they minimize sacrifices and stability. Self-sufficiency's benefits can only be maximized once all farmers are responsible in production and land use, not overproducing and not wasting water. That's not the case, and that never will be, because no matter how much the government regulates, farming at the end of the day requires so much resources in it of itself that the public is deprived of it. California is facing country by droughts because farmers are using all their water. That's the world the government lives in, even in their possible best case. Note that we aren't banning or destroying self-sufficiency because logically import means export, and we still have a bit of self-sufficiency. It's just that we prioritize external grains. Having that said, some rebuttals. First, about necessity. We agree that the state has the obligation to provide food. We completely agree. Countries in Africa, they talk about have self-sufficiency programs, right? But we say expansion of agriculture. For the expansion of agriculture throughout the country, resources needed for mass agriculture and delivering the food to communities itself, that itself is a problem they never address. And then secondly, about how high-class people get it all. Firstly, just because something is imported doesn't mean it's expensive. Meat is exported, rice is exported, and it's not as expensive so that only the millionaires can afford it. Factually not true. But secondly, it's in fact worse on their side. Countries that export are likely to have lots of affordable grain and lots of cheap self-sufficiency technology. If you're receiving an import, it probably means you're not as advanced. So if you try to be self-sufficient with not as much experience, it could be even more expensive. And note that America doesn't grow as much rice, but they still have cheaper prices compared to Korea, who is self-sufficient, proving that it always doesn't depend on foreign trade, right? But thirdly, even if high-class people get it all, as the first government speaker said, countries have an obligation to save their citizens, and we agree, meaning that governments will likely decrease prices of the import and sell for a lower price to the citizens, even if its international value is higher. It's not going to be a problem either way. Next, about humanitarian aid as a checks and balance. To get politicians to donate, you need political interest. People these days only care about their own political situation, like the January 6th, meaning that even if there is aid, it wouldn't be as much. Note that humanitarian aid only goes to countries in extremely drastic situations, because now there's so many countries with floods and stuff, and I'm not sure how they expect countries like the United States to help these countries when the United States already has consistent natural disasters that they can barely address. Third argument about amount and waste. Firstly, when countries try to become self-sufficient, then they also have to worry about the economy. That means the government has to supervise grain sales and make sure the prices don't increase or decrease to maintain a healthy economy. Farmers are money-driven, meaning that they overproduce frequently and the demand is not as huge. So if the government didn't intervene, then prices of grain would go up and down, making farmers' livelihoods unstable and bankrupt. For instance, like South Korea relies on itself to produce rice, and millions of dollars of grain are bought by the government to keep farmers from going bankrupt and to keep prices moderately high. These rices are dumped in storage facilities where then they're left to rot. And that's the only alternative, because other alternatives like giving out free food and that generally decreases the cost of rice, hurting farmers. We have also tried letting farmers continue to sell freely, but that creates drastic changes in prices of rice. Alternatives fail and they make rice unaffordable or extremely affordable, making the farmers' livelihoods destroyed both ways. So the point is, to have self-sufficiency, you need to waste millions of dollars worth of grain and land, and we say that's a complete waste, especially in this starving world, especially in this terrible world. So that's immoral in and of itself. But secondly, let me explain how we achieve that better, because now you just do international exports, right? And it doesn't use the country's important resources. Money can always be replaced by rotting food, but like rotting food environments and land, they cannot be replaced, or at least it takes much more longer to replace. So there are worst cases when they have to prove how countries with no fertile land or farming background can be self-sufficient, right? And we say they never proved that even this far into the debate. And that is why I'm more than proud to oppose. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Second opposition, I'd like to call the third speaker for prop to include the substantive.
Give me a moment, let me set up my time. Am I visible and audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. Then with that in mind, my time will start in 3, 2, 1. Now, I would like to make some points of rebuttal. First, they told you that farming requires a lot of resources. Well, it's funny how they brought the example of the US, considering the fact that this example proves our point. The US, who imports a lot of their food, something that said themselves, has one of the highest food prices. This is to point out where the lower classes can't even afford to buy the food. International trade also requires a lot of resources, and so is farming. Now, at least in agriculture, it is more sustainable, and we have proven it with the DPM speech.
We improve the cycle of economical growth. Why? It is because we create more innovation on our side of the house, which is why we believe that our side should be more focused on. Now, we also told you that humanitarian aid would be sufficient, and they disagreed. We will prove them wrong for the following reasons. First is the global image. Big countries like the US and China wants to prove their global image, and they want to spread their ring of influence. Now, how would they do this? It is by supporting countries in need, such as how China supports countries in Africa for food shortages, among other things, which would just expand their sphere of influence. Now, despite if in this said scenario that other countries do not provide any sort of pressure, there will still be pressure from their own citizens. Like, for example, in the recent fire in Haiti, where the citizens of the US are currently pressing the US government to provide more money to the victims of the fire in Haiti. Now, moving on to my third rebuttal. They told you that farmers overproduce frequently. That point at itself does not even make any sense due to this multiple structural reasons. Firstly, is that there is no economical incentive to do so, as they wasted the product and it will not be bought. That will result in a loss. Why would they do so? Why would they do so then? They would obviously use this said wasted product and be reused to be resold to the international trade, which would only benefit them. And just to be clear, we are not against international trade, but we just believe that food sufficiency should be supported. Now, there are also checks and balances which could occur by sustainability organizations, which is somewhat regular industry practice that can be implemented. Their side is simply talking about disasters here and there, like the example brought up by the proposition about the fires and the famines in California. This is so extreme. I would like to point out a lack of engagement from their side to ours on the volatility of international trade again and again, which would be a key point of contention within the debate. Now, the point that our first speaker has brought up should even prove down their arguments. Their arguments are also extremely elitist. No developing countries can afford the imports of the products by the international trade because of the lack of money they have and their financial condition. Now, especially after this said, now adjudicators, imagine a world where a child sits in front of you, holding their stomach, crying for you to give just a grain of rice. However, their country's government just does international trade with other countries, which does not help the local citizen, but just trickle down the most vulnerable group. They are all left starving. Now, our side, they support hands food for us and support our side. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Third prop, I'd like to call the third opposition speaker.
Am I both clearly visible and audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, thank you. So pronouns are she, her if you need to address me, and I would prefer verbal POIs, please. So therefore, my speech will start in 3, 2, 1. Side proposition fails to recognize the aftermath of self-sufficiency. 3 main flaws I would like to identify. A, they have 0 responses to our burden of proof on how self-sufficiency is necessarily stable. B, they did not prove to us how development still exists on their side. And C, they harm the poor and vulnerable undeveloped countries. Let's explain their side in one scenario. A vulnerable country has an upcoming famine. Instead of asking other countries to help them and trade valuable crops in order for everyone to survive, their side simply abandons them and makes them fend for themselves. Panel, we've proven to you how on our model, the mechanism on how we benefit every single country and how we help developing countries as well. 2 questions to prove how we win the debate. So first question, which method has more stability, which we proved in our burden of proof? 2 responses here. So firstly, we increased development under our side, right? We already mentioned examples like water and land because the land left over should be used for other kinds of development and use it for very meaningful purposes. Let's go to the impact analysis. Things like infrastructure, or things like healthcare, or things like education are going to increase under our model, right? Also, when a country goes through war, we clearly told you that this increases the amount of diplomatic relations because they can support you not only in things like war, but natural disasters or times of struggle when that country genuinely needs help very urgently. But secondly, on their side, they waste even more resources. For instance, our second speaker told you about the South Korean example where millions of dollars worth of grain of rice is left to rot in dump warehouses. Not only that, but agriculture itself, because it requires so much water, right? And wasted water take a long time to replace. Farmers make crops near streams and rivers, building mechanisms where the water continuously flows to the crop. This year, right now in California, droughts are happening, water prices are skyrocketing, and land is so dry that it is beginning to crack and lose fertility. To have self-sufficiency means to have self-responsibility, control, and humbleness. That's not even close to the farmers we see today. In the real world, their model never stands, and they never provided why this does not. Second question, which side actually helps the most vulnerable citizens or the most vulnerable country? Side government says in a very simplistic logic that on our side, the only stakeholder we help is the middle class. Okay, A, we told you that when the status
Levi,
climate change, no thank you, and global warming happens, it will lead to a lot of natural disasters happening. On their model, you are leaving these vulnerable countries to care only for themselves. Panel, they're abandoning them. Panel, they're leaving them alone to die. At least on our side, these people will be getting help from other kinds of countries that are actually able and have the capacity to trade them goods that can help them actually survive and get over the natural disasters that happen in the status quo. We concede to the fact that natural disasters exist on our side too, obviously because they're natural disasters. However, we say that it's so much better than their side because at least we have more checks and balances while they just leave citizens dying. But B, furthermore, this motion is not specifically about authoritarian regimes. When the Prime Minister
Levi,
talked about how resources from change, no thank you, will not trickle down to the lowest class and the most amount of vulnerable people, they were talking specifically about dictators that would be selfish enough to take all of those foreign resources for themselves, but not the majority of countries. But also, as our DLO told you, important resources aren't necessarily expensive, right? At least, for instance, the rice my mother buys from the grocery store costs less than my iPhone, right? But before I end my speech, let's do some weighing, right? So this debate came down to mainly who actually minimizes suffering, as well as who actually minimizes the amount of sacrifices given. So we say that even in our worst case scenario, at least we benefit the most vulnerable countries. At least we provided our burden of proof on how vulnerable countries will be helped on our side, because they have other countries to rely on in order to support, in order for them to receive a lot of support from like urgent situations like famines or natural disasters. So we say that the countries where so many people die of starvation and famine are most helped on our side. We see that this is so much more than simply benefiting the middle class, which side proposition gave in their very first rebuttal. We say that this is actually a debate that came down to which side actually benefits these kinds of vulnerable countries and which side actually helps them gain the most amount of support. We say that on our side, because they're more close to diplomatic relations between countries, we help the vulnerable side the most. And that is why I'm so proud to oppose it.
Much proposition. Thank you very much to the third speaker for opposition. I'd like to call the opposition reply speaker.
Okay, assuming that I'm again audible and visible, I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. Land, environment, and water cannot be replaced, but money can. And that's why they lose the debate. We agree that trade costs more money, but in the long term, proposition self-sufficiency model costs even more money and resources. That's why in terms of stability and reasonability, we take this debate easily. So my speech will be focused on which side actually helps the poor citizens, the most vulnerable stakeholder. So proposition team spends 12 minutes of your time panel trying to tell you that important resources from foreign countries will only go to the millionaires, and the poor, suffering, tragic laborers will not even have a tiny sliver of meat in their mouths. In fact, I was very truly and sincerely touched by the government whip's elaborate story on how a hungry child is staring into your eyes, clutching his empty stomach and begging for a single grain of rice. But we completely destroyed this point in 3 ways. First, the countries that aren't controlled by authoritarian regimes, aka the majority of developing countries, will not necessarily take away these resources from the poorer class, right? But second, our DLO told you that these important resources won't really be so expensive at the end of the day. Like, is rice expensive? Is water expensive? Not in most cases, right? Therefore, developing countries lose all of their agriculture and whatnot, then they can still trade with other countries for those vital resources. Of course, the DPM said that, well, like trade falls as well if there's a natural disaster like a flood, because the buyer or the poor country does not have anything to trade back. But our DLO clearly explained that since food and necessary items to survival aren't that expensive, it can still be bought by the developing country at the end of the day, right? So this is why we maximize stability. We have plan B, we have plan C, we have plan D, and then we have it like until plan C basically. But finally, proposition told you that we can have humanitarian aid as like a checks and balances, but we rebutted his point by saying that to get politicians to actually donate, you need political interest, and people these days only care about like about their own political situation, meaning that even if there is aid, it won't be much. Note that humanitarian aid only goes to countries in extremely drastic situations. So, Judge, if you remember the burden I set on proposition at the beginning of the debate, then you know exactly what I mean when I say that government failed to prove this burden. The DPM said that, oh, even if there is a flood that wipes out the fields of grain, you can't get trade to get more wheat. But the speaker never explained how their side can prevent the problem. So once again, for that starving kid, we give him grain. The other side, Gov side, they waste that rice without helping that kid. And therefore, I'm so proud to oppose.
Thank you very much to the opposition reply. I'd like to call the proposition reply speaker to conclude this debate.
Adjudicator, just another clarification. Am I visible and audible?
Yes.
All right, thank you very much for that. Let me quickly set a timer. Okay. My time will start in 3, 2, 1. Adjudicator. Side opposition has failed to even understand the spirit of the motion in the first place, evident ever since the first speaker. In addition to that, they strawman throughout the entire engagements with the argument. These facts alone themselves should be weighed lower within the debate. And we'll prove to you why in all the major clashes which were valid, we win. The first major clash within debate occurred when opposition said the developing countries are infertile, hence they cannot grow agriculture. Why? Because there are more chances of disasters in these countries. However, our DPM has told you and thrown this point out the window because one, on their best case scenario, the disasters do happen and the only alternative is international trade. They don't acknowledge the existence of humanitarian aid. We told you that this is the most important why, and it has never been engaged with because we told you that there's a moral obligation of the international community, such as organizations like the UN and the USA, to provide disaster aid. We also told you that on their side, this is not exclusive, hence international trade will also be altered. The next major clash is the amount of resources that we use. We clearly win in this clash. Why? Because all they told you is an assertion. The only example that they gave you is that farmers need water to grow their crops. We respond to this and even preempt in our DPM speech, which note has stood the test of time throughout the debate, which he told you that we create more innovation. On our side, we don't need to spend money on tariff, distribution costs, and production costs. Hence, we can allocate the money towards development of technology to more sustainable agricultural practices, thus deleting food malnourishment within the country. Our PM also preempted this and told you that we don't know where the tax from international trade will be used for because it will be used for roads and other infrastructure because this, ladies and gentlemen, is not what they need the most. The reason is because these citizens need nourishment. They need the food. Like previously mentioned, there's a starving kid in front of you who wants this grain. The fact of the matter is that on side opposition, they never give this food. Why? Because it doesn't trickle down. We told you how elitist side opposition was. However, our side has proven throughout the entire case the effectivity of encouraging food sufficiency, actually giving tangible food towards the citizens over relying on the volatile, hostile, and unforgiving international trade markets, which is why I've never been prouder to stand Gov. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Proposition reply. Speakers can shake hands across the floor. Thank you very much for an excellent debate. Judges, let's move to the up prep to deliberate.